In the younger days of home media, even 10 years ago, the idea of black bars was something that a lot of people had a problem with many releases being cropped to fit whatever screen size was popular at the time, a process known as pan and scan. As TVs have gotten bigger and resolutions higher, viewing a film as it was shot has become a more widely accepted form of presentation, and the infamous black bar is less of a burden to the average viewer. But the way people think about aspect ratios, that is, the ratio between the width and the height of a frame, is still, in many ways, quite rigid and defined by convention. It might sound weird to some, but in my opinion, aspect ratio is a very powerful tool in how you tell a story, and a highly underappreciated element of shot composition. There's actually a lot of interesting history behind the changing standards, and for those who care to look, a lot of interesting experimentation going on. Today there are essentially three major aspect ratios used in popular media. We have the two popular cinema formats, 1.85:1 and 2.39:1, and for TV there is 1.78:1 or 16:9, which since the mid-2000s has been the standard dimension for TVs and monitors, made as a compromise between the cinematic widescreen of 2.39:1 and the classic television ratio of 4:3. Though why they didn't just make it the very similar existing ratio of 1.85:1, I'm not sure. Historically, aspect ratios have largely been about convenience, marketing, and technology. Academy ratio was developed as simply a frame 4 perforations tall on a 35mm film strip with a space at the side for the optical soundtrack to be recorded. This was disturbed by the introduction of TV, which incited studios to present new special features to keep audiences flocking to cinemas. The answer was wider images, and widescreen aspect ratios were developed that would be, at the time, unique to the cinematic experience. Some of these formats, most of which appeared during the 50s and 60s, included Vistavision, where the 35mm negative was run horizontally through the camera to capture a 1.85:1 image, 2.35:1 and 2.66:1 Cinemascope, which use anamorphic lenses to compress a wider image onto a film strip which could then be decompressed with an anamorphic projector lens for viewership. Cinerama, a peculiar format involving 3 Academy ratio cameras filming side by side to create a panoramic view which 3 projectors would then show in special theaters, and many more. As detail and film stock improved, ratios became more standardized, though it has never been quite as simple as some may think. In Europe, for many decades, 1.66:1 was the most common standard ratio, and this ratio was often used in the US in the 60s and early 70s, before 1.85:1 became more ubiquitous. In the modern era, digital cameras and projection mean we are no longer bound by the issues of film formats and projector capabilities, which artistically should give filmmakers more freedom than ever. So what, beyond the technical and marketing components, is the creative value of aspect ratio, and why is it something that is worth thinking about as a filmmaker? Largely, it comes down to how different ratios lend themselves to different compositions and relate to human psychology. A rather oversimplified answer you may hear from some is that widescreen aspect ratios are simply more cinematic. While I don't think this is necessarily an invalid perspective, I think it's worth looking into more. I think it's fair to say that this is somewhat a matter of association. While it is changing somewhat now, traditionally movies released in cinemas would typically be the only place that you'd see widescreen formats, and it has been used by the majority of blockbusters since the 50s and is often specifically associated with anamorphic photography, even if the film itself is not shot anamorphic. So when people think of something uniquely cinematic, widescreen is likely to come to mind. But let's also look at how it frames objects. Widescreen ratios like the common 2.39:1 work fantastically for things like landscapes, fight scenes, vehicles, or just generally wider group shots. These are images often associated with big budget cinema, images that can be quite breathtaking, and they're all things that take up more horizontal space than vertical. A film like Lawrence of Arabia is a great example, as it does an incredible job at showing the vast remoteness of the desert. The Lord of the Rings films use the ratio to great effect, showing stunning vistas and sprawling battle sequences. But there are things that wider ratios sometimes struggle to frame nicely. Close-ups especially often feel like they have a lot of empty space or are weirdly cropped. Although this may not bother many if the background is not distracting, it's hard to deny that these shots look cleaner and more nicely framed in a taller ratio. Conversely, as seen in some of the westerns of Sergio Leone, 2.39 can frame an extreme close-up of eyes much better than 16:9, which adds distracting detail. In addition to close-ups, 16:9 and other taller ratios generally do much better at framing taller, grander objects, which might call into question the claims of widescreen being more cinematic. These can include things like taller buildings, which to be seen in full must often be viewed from rather distant in wider ratios, with distracting detail to either side. A famous but powerful example of using a taller aspect ratio for this reason is Spielberg's Jurassic Park, where the extra height of the image made it easier to emphasize the domineering and awe-inspiring height of the dinosaurs as they towered above other characters. The 1.85:1 ratio is a perfect balance of film, giving enough breadth for the world to feel vast but enough height for the dinosaurs to look huge. It's a shame that the newer Jurassic World movies don't keep this philosophy and don't even stay consistent between them, initially compromising with 2.0:1 in Jurassic World and then going all the way to 2.39:1 in Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom. These same qualities are made even more significant in ratios that are rarely used today, like 1.66:1 and 1.37:1, Academy ratio. The Academy ratio seems made for the close-up, framing a human head perfectly. This ratio can also be used as a way of showing claustrophobia, often by depicting scenes with imagery stuffed up right to the edges of the screen. Also, due to the history of this ratio, it's often used to build an association with the past. The film No, for example, uses a similar ratio to evoke 80s television, working in combination with the videotape look of the film. One of my favourite modern examples of Academy ratio where the frame is used to its full advantage is the Grand Budapest Hotel. Set in a fictional European country, the film makes extensive use of mountainous scenery, high-roofed European architecture, and characters positioned in a vertical manner. It emphasises the grandiosity of its locales and is perfectly utilised in framing faces. This also brings up the subject of changing aspect ratios. This was once, if not impossible, highly impractical, but in the age of flexible digital cinema, has been experimented with to both exemplary and disastrous effect. The Grand Budapest Hotel uses multiple aspect ratios as a storytelling device, showing a story framed within a story, with the different layers of storytelling and subsequently time periods depicted by aspect ratios and other filmic devices commonly associated with them. Other films use aspect ratios to differentiate characters or moods. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World uses shifting ratios to show dream sequences and to recreate the stylized and varied shapes of comic book panels. In It Comes at Night, the height of the screen literally shrinks through the final sequence as the characters feel the horror of their actions oppressively close in on them. The Hunger Games Catching Fire changes into its IMAX ratio by fairly quickly increasing the height of the screen as Katniss is raised into the outdoor arena, moving her from a claustrophobic space into an open one. Interestingly, these last two are examples where claustrophobia and oppressive mood are represented by a wider frame rather than a thinner one, as although the ratio of width to height becomes thinner due to the films taking up less of their frame in their wider ratios, the overall screen space increases as the image transitions to a less wide ratio, which is actually a taller ratio. IMAX format is one of the most common technical reasons in the modern day for presenting unusual ratios. Christopher Nolan also uses this extensively in his films, mixing in IMAX footage with wider or less tall footage from regular 35mm film, but in my opinion, generally to poor effect. IMAX film is 70mm film shot horizontally with 15 perforations per frame, capturing a huge amount of detail, and with an aspect ratio of 1.43:1. In digital projection on IMAX screens, this is often shown as 1.9:1. On digital releases, Nolan usually lets it fill a 1.78:1 screen, and in film screenings, IMAX is shown in its native 1.43:1. Nolan, being unable to afford to shoot films fully in IMAX, often mixes in this IMAX footage with 35mm anamorphic footage with a ratio of 2.39:1. That's a dramatic difference in height when shown digitally, but when seen in true IMAX film, is almost double the height during the IMAX sequences. Now, this would be fine if it was used purposefully, but in Nolan's film, those transitions are sudden and to some extent can seem arbitrary. In Interstellar, it's generally used for action sequences and space shots, but sometimes the transitions are very rapid or at points they don't fit any kind of purposeful theme. It's simply jarring and makes it simply bizarre that he chose to shoot the other segments in anamorphic 35mm, making not only the ratio but also the resolution and general look very different. This practice has become more commonplace too, being an issue with Transformers 5 and Aquaman, although I don't think anyone is really surprised that Michael Bay would be careless about artistic purpose. YMS recently talked about the pointless use of changing aspect ratio in Lucy in the Sky.
Whenever the black bars appeared on screen, you would see them shift into place. Some of the aspect ratios were so extreme and ridiculous, and I don't know why they did it. All of a sudden, we're at a golf course and it changes to like 16:2. There was a point where it was 4:3, but it was all the way to the left of the frame.
Still, overall, there is a lot of experimentation with ratios at the moment, so what do I mean when I say that they are still viewed through a lens of rigidity and convention? Well, these unusual efforts are still generally viewed as quirks. The reason the changing aspect ratios in Nolan and others' films have little artistic function is because they're not about the ratio, they're about showing off IMAX technology. The belief that wider ratios are inherently more cinematic is ingrained.
I think there's just like a sense of serious film with a widescreen aspect ratio.
Hence why Spielberg's philosophy about taller frames for dinosaurs was compromised on and then later thrown away entirely. It's why many movies in 2.39:1 are largely close-ups and singles and leave loads of wasted screen space. Academy ratio may have come back into fashion for some indie films, mainly those set in the past, but it's not often a choice made simply for its inherent compositional value, and other ratios are often disregarded as real options for filmmaking. I recently shot a film in an unconventional ratio of 14:9, and despite it being nested within a 16:9 container that would eliminate any projection challenges, it was still not accepted by many festivals explicitly because it was not either 16:9, 1.85:1, or 2.39:1. Automatically, if you want to try for a ratio that is unusual, you may be barred from many festival options, pressuring filmmakers to conform to traditional ratio expectations. We can also look at how ratios have historically been, and in some cases still are, cropped to fit our screens. As I mentioned at the start, this technique, known as pan and scan, was done sometimes with effort, panning the image horizontally to create a nicer frame, and sometimes lazily, with simply scaling up and cropping to remove black bars from the top and bottom of a film to make it fit the 4x3 TV screens that were common up until the mid-2000s. Because TVs were very small originally, viewers wanted their films to fill the full screen, and also, it seems, they really just hated black bars. It's a shame that this practice remained prevalent long after TVs became large and even widened to 16:9 because it ruins one of the most vital aspects of cinematography and visual storytelling, framing.
They're getting 50%, literally 50% of the information, as you can see for yourself. There's half an image there.
Often, the shape of the TV is simply not enough to convey all the important information in a shot, and certainly not the full emotion of a shot. The beloved and long-defunct video essay YouTube channel, Every Frame a Painting, wasn't called that for no reason. This is somebody's artwork. Whatever ratio the director and cinematographer chose initially, if they are good at their job, they will carefully plan shots to fit that frame and take full advantage of it. And pan and scanning essentially tells the audiences that it doesn't matter what lies outside the central portion of the frame. It is still common to see old 4x3 shows cropped vertically to fit our new 16:9 TVs. Many traditional broadcasters still crop widescreen films, and there is still little respect paid to unusual ratios like the 1.66:1 ratio that was in use in the latter half of the 20th century. A good example of this is the history of Barry Lyndon Blu-ray releases. Several of Kubrick's films from the 60s and 70s were shot for 1.66:1, including Barry Lyndon. In this case, it was chosen specifically for its similarity to the golden ratio of 1.61:1, utilized in Baroque paintings of the time, with the cinematography designed to resemble these paintings in form, lighting, content, and framing. Kubrick's notes make it clear that although it was shot in 4x3, which is how it was released on VHS and DVD initially, it was definitely intended to be projected at 1.66:1. Anything else was a compromise. Enthusiasts were disappointed when the Blu-ray was eventually released in 16:9, going from being too uncropped from the negative to being cropped too much. Kubrick also allowed compromise shooting The Shining, knowing home media was becoming a thing. He shot in 4x3 again, but his notes explain that the film was to be framed for 1.85:1 and projected for 4x3. His crew even failed to protect the taller frame in a few cases, which is why a helicopter is visible over the Overlook Hotel in the 4x3 footage. This is a problem for 4x3 home media, but not for the intended 1.85:1 presentation. I know I may sound like a curmudgeon or a pedant, but it's my opinion that a film should be shot to be shown one way and one way only. If there is a true vision, it should be represented. Blade Runner 2049 was released in both 2.39:1 and 1.9:1 for digital IMAX. Roger Deakins shot this with the knowledge that it would be shown in either ratio. But what was his intended frame? Did Deakins think it was important to see what was above the commonly seen 2.39 frame, or did he not? Did he want the shot to feel closer on his characters' faces, or feel wider? One of these ratios must be the less than ideal frame. One must display either too much or not enough information to convey perfectly what the director and cinematographer wanted to convey. The main reason I wanted to make a video on this, beyond my general interest in the topic, is that I want to show people that there is value in going outside of common standards in filmmaking. The fact that something has come to be a default in filmmaking does not mean that it's inherently a superior way to make films. Some of you might be thinking, who really cares what aspect ratio a film uses? But it's another tool in a creative arsenal that can be used to create distinct psychological effects on an audience. And due to what is widely accepted as cinematic, or appropriate, more by trends and convention than any real necessity, filmmakers, festivals, and distributors alike often dismiss the creative possibilities that it offers. The same could be said for other currently popular trends in technique, like lighting styles, narrative structures, and more. Let's encourage filmmakers to be smart and understand the reasons certain techniques are used, but also to be brave and creative, to go beyond standard expectations and make films that stand out, films that are unique, films that do things that nobody has ever seen before. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, please like and subscribe. And why not check out some of the other video essays I've made? You can find the playlist for them, as well as the playlist for the films that I've made, on the main page of my channel. Thanks again, and see you later.